How many of you were enthralled by your history textbooks? A few? You stayed up late at night under the blanket with a flashlight reading history, right? How many of you are history majors? Let's see your hands. How many of you took more than 5 history classes in college or high school? Okay. For most of us, though, history is a class we have to take to graduate. It is something that requires us to memorize some dates and some places and some names, take a test, and get a degree or a diploma. And most of us know that history is an important part of a well-rounded education. And we may have heard a quote, something to the effect of, "Those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it." But the actual quote is from a man named George Santayana. And in 1905, in a book entitled A Life of Reason, he wrote, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." 2 critically important words. The first, remembering. Remembering is memory. It is a recollection of experience. And the second, condemn. Condemnation implies our guilt. We are willing participants in our own demise if we fail to remember the past. Because history, even what we teach, is our memory as a society. It is how we pass on the context of what we learned, the actions we took, what led us to that path, and the results, the real human impact of those decisions and actions. It is that context that is important. That memory allows us to share our greatest triumphs as a species. And it also allows us to recall and remember our most shameful and horrible failures, so that as we learn what took us to that place, we can avoid going there again. As we look around our country today and we see the rise of fascism and ethnocentrism and hate, it is not a coincidence it happens at the same moment that the very people who fought those things in Europe in the 1930s and 40s are dying. With them, they take our memory. And without the memory of the past, we are condemned to repeat it. I want to take you further back, though. There's another echo in our history right now in this country. We are very divided. We all know that sitting here today. In fact, Pew Research just released a study that showed that we are more divided now as a country than any point in our history since the American Civil War. Think about that for a second. The last time we were this divided as a people, we were literally killing each other over it. And at that point in that war, there was a leader who stood on a stage and tried to make sense of it all and tried to express why the price we were paying was worth it for the promise that is America. That leader was Abraham Lincoln. And you know the speech he gave. It was the Gettysburg Address. Many of you learned this in school. It is only 10 sentences long, far shorter than what I'm doing here on this stage. If you know the Gettysburg Address, say the first line of it with me. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. You learned it. You memorized it. When you learned it, you probably didn't understand it. With age and experience, you may have gained some context. If you studied history, you may have understood the historical facts and events that led up to it. But it wasn't the true experience of humanity. You see, we have a tradition of teaching these things from teacher to student to teacher in an oral history that goes back before the ancient Greeks. And somewhere in the 20th century, because of industrialization or the requirements of a modern society, we realized we had to be more efficient, and so we distilled down the context and the meaning of history into those things that could be easily measured on a Scantron sheet. And we lost the experience of history. It's funny, George Santayana was a bit of a visionary. He said, the great difficulty in education is to get experience out of ideas. Ideas are wonderful, and we're here to share them today. But experience is what changes your behavior in the future. It is the recollections of your past that changes your trajectory. So how do we give history students in modern education experience? The easiest method would be time travel. And I can't do that yet, but I can transport your mind. You see, virtual reality is very interesting. It is a psychoactive technology. Research at Stanford in their laboratory for virtual reality and human behavior demonstrates that your mind cannot tell the difference between virtual reality and reality. And so we could put you on a field in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, standing in the crowd. And that experience would become your memory. You would experience it as a personal narrative. You would understand better context and emotion and human impact, and it would cease to be words on a page and become real. This is exciting for me as a storyteller because there are kind of three layers of narrative that we work with. The first is dictated narrative. Most of you who tell stories understand this one. We have two events and a cause and effect. The king died, the queen died of grief. That's a story. And that's the kind of story we tell very often. And the brain loves that story, and it's very interested in it. One layer deeper is something called self-assembled narrative. And this, if you watch Game of Thrones or Lost or Westworld, is where we feed you little bits of information and scenes and frames of reference, and your mind assembles the story. You build the story on the fly. And every time a new reveal or a new piece of information reaches you, you have to rebuild the story. And one layer deeper is participatory narrative. Now, this is where you are in the story. Everything that happens to you is important to you because it happens to you. It's the most important thing. Right here on this edge of self-assembled narrative and participatory narrative, this very powerful point of immersion. I only need to make you the witness in history to immerse you in it. Most of the people in history were not actors, they were witnesses. And so I can use it to change your behavior because we know it works already. We use it to train medical personnel to engage in complex procedures that risk human life because using virtual reality, they build the neural pathways and the muscle memory to perform those operations when it really counts based on their experience in virtual reality. We use it to train first responders so that they are faced with difficult and complex life-threatening situations. They can make mistakes where it does not cost lives. But the brain doesn't care that that was virtual reality. It remembers those experiences and those outputs when it is actually faced with a situation. And so those first responders remember their past and are therefore not condemned to repeat it. Now, I can't just drop you on a battlefield in the middle of a war. Your brain can't tell the difference. We would traumatize our high school students. They would all have PTSD. And while we're using virtual reality to treat PTSD, I don't think we want to fill that pipeline just yet. So I'm not going to put you on Omaha Beach on D-Day in Normandy, but I could put you on a glider on the night before. And you could sit with men who are about to jump out of that plane and listen to their stories and hear why they care about what's at home and understand their fear and their courage and why they are willing to make the ultimate sacrifice to ensure fascism never rises again on this planet. And that would become your memory. You would remember that as if it happened to you. Now, I know many of you are thinking this is kind of high-tech stuff. It's probably very expensive. There's a lot of hardware and a lot of cost. And you might be thinking virtual reality involves something like this. But in fact, with $1 worth of plastic lenses and the old cardboard from a pizza box, we can build virtual reality headsets for the phone you already have in your pocket. Your phone is a virtual reality engine. 85% of American high school students have access to smartphones today. The other 15% would have them tomorrow if we donated our phones instead of throwing them out or recycling them. For $30, we can outfit an entire classroom with the capability to view virtual reality. That's the cost. And it is difficult to create virtual reality production in the sense that what you know about movie and TV and film, the jump cut, the pan shot, the close-up, those things cease to exist. Because in virtual reality, the viewer is the camera. They choose what to see and where to look. However, we have history on how to tell those stories. Because on the stage, you use lighting and sound cues and blocking to drive the narrative. And it may seem like it's expensive to produce this kind of content, but I can tell you that using off-the-shelf components 2 years ago, a small team and I produced a 4-minute spaceflight experience based on Carl Sagan's pale blue dot. We built the solar system at scale, and we wrapped each planet with the scans from the public domain available NASA files of those planets. And we built all of that in 4 months for less than $20,000. The planet you see in front of you, this picture of Earth, is not a picture. This is a CGI-generated 3D model that we built. That's the quality that can be built with off-the-shelf components. So now, what is that experience like? What does it look like? I can't put headsets on all of you right now, but I'm going to ask you to imagine with me what that experience is. So for a second, imagine putting a headset on, and when you open your eyes, you're on a field in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It is November, late November. It's cold. Won't be above 60 today. You're standing in a crowd of 7,000 people who have come here to watch this national cemetery be consecrated. Behind us is a wall of cavalry horses with mounted soldiers, a complete line at the back of the crowd. They push forward, nudging us towards the dais. And we can hear the rustle of saddle leather and the jingle of spurs. Off in the distance, in the middle distance, we see the field that 4 months prior held the Battle of Gettysburg. And while there are no casualties remaining, the flotsam and jetsam of that terrible battle still exist. There are pieces of broken rifle and pieces of wagon wheel and bandages and strips of cloth and old canteens still littered about. Standing in the very front row of the crowd, right in front of the dais, is a line of men in bandages, missing limbs and eyes, on crutches and in chairs. And they hold in front of them a homemade banner. On it is painted, First Army of the Potomac, Invalid Division. These are the men who fought and were wounded at Gettysburg. And they stand and look up at a president who sent them into battle. Lincoln rises and walks to the center of the stage. He is a tall man. He is a gaunt man. He has already lost one child and another is sick. He's not a very popular president. And he looks into the faces of people asking why this division is here. What do we do next? Why did we pay this terrible price? Then he begins to speak, the address that you learned. Lincoln had a high voice. It wasn't low and resonant. And he didn't use his hands to gesticulate. He held tightly a single piece of paper on which the Gettysburg Address was written, although he did not look at it because he had it memorized. And he spoke to Americans about how the promise of liberty and equality was why we had to pay this terrible price. He spoke about how that promise is the very thing that this war is being fought about. He spoke the ground that we're standing on could not be consecrated or made hallowed in any way further than the sacrifices of those who fought and died here and poured out their last full measure of devotion. And that by making that sacrifice, it demands the responsibility in us as a country to come together, to heal divide, to move forward, to build on the promise of equality and liberty. That sacrifice cannot be in vain. And to ensure together that government by the people, of the people, and for the people shall never perish from this earth. That moment, that experience, that resonating truth of who we are and where we need to go, that is the memory we can give your students. That is the experience they can carry with them so that they remember the past, and we are never, ever condemned to repeat it. Thank you very much.